Hi, everyone. We'll get started here. This is Nicole Perlerat. I'll be moderating a panel with you today on countering ransomware, which is obviously top of mind right now. Ransomware is not a new threat, it's an old one. And it seems to, for whatever reason, be getting significantly worse. Over the last year, we've seen ransomware hit hospitals, cities, schools, but also American mainstays like gas and meat and NBA basketball and minor league baseball and God forbid the ferry to Martha's Vineyard and sophisticated companies like Quanta, the Apple supplier. So here with us today, we have an amazing panel. And just before I get into intros, I have one housekeeping item, which is that in the latter half of this program, we'll take questions from you, the audience. So at any time during the program, you can submit your questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. When you do that, please include your name and affiliation if you feel comfortable doing so we have some context. And now for intros. So with us today in alphabetical order are Sean Joyce, who is a principal at PricewaterhouseCoopers advisory practice, where he is the lead in the global and US cybersecurity, privacy, and forensics. He is also the former deputy director of the FBI and the chief trust officer at Airbnb. We also have Chris Krebs, who's the founding partner of the Krebs Stamos Group. And he's also the former director of the Federal Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA. And he's a senior Newmark fellow in cybersecurity policy at the Aspen Institute. Raj Samani is chief scientist at McAfee. He's also the founder of No More Ransom, which is an organization dedicated to helping the victims of ransomware. And finally, we have Kemba Walden, who is assistant general counsel at Microsoft in the digital crimes unit. And she also was the co-chair and helped launch the public-private ransomware task force that just came out with a very comprehensive set of recommendations for tackling ransomware. So the first question I'd like to throw out to you all is, why does ransomware suddenly feel so categorically different than what we have experienced in the past? Why do these ransomware attacks suddenly feel so visceral? And I think I'll start with you, Chris, and then we'll move on from there.
Hey, Nicole, thanks for that. It's great to be here. I think it's primarily because they hit key parts of the critical infrastructure community. They hit the kind of capital centers between oil and gas and food supply. But make no mistake that this has been an accretive trend over the last several years. The ransomware task force that Kemba was a part of has been focused on this issue since last summer. And so it's not just, it all happened all of a sudden in the Biden administration. This has been something that's we've been building up to. And I think there are three primary reasons. First is that, even as we try to improve defenses across the critical infrastructure in our businesses and our state and local governments, we still just can't get the basics covered because, frankly, the basics are still hard. The second is that the economic model supporting ransomware has been validated time and time again, and in part it's been enabled by cryptocurrencies and the ability to transfer money outside the eye of the traditional fiat currency. And then third and finally is these actors, these ransomware gangs, have been given plenty of room to run. They have a safe harbor, many of them in Russia, under the watchful eye of the Kremlin. Now, that's not to say that these are Russian government directed actions, but nonetheless, they've been given plenty of room to run, and they just haven't felt meaningful consequences. So as long as there's vulnerabilities to exploit, there's money in it, and there are no real consequences, it will continue.
Sean, I wanted to ask you about that safe harbor issue. Some people have come out and said, we don't have a ransomware problem, we have a Russia problem. What is your take on the safe harbor issue, and what can we do to address this?
So thanks, Nicole. And I think it kind of tags along with what Chris was saying, right? We have to have this multi-pronged approach when we look at this. And one of them is, when you look at the top ransomware variants, whether it's Revo, Conti, Doppelpaymer, there's one thing in common. Russia, right? And I think we have to establish, like when you look at a whole of government approach with the private sector, it's that diplomatic, law enforcement, and unfortunately at times that military actions that are necessary. And I think, there has to be a clear message between, President Biden and Putin that this behavior is unacceptable and there are red lines. And I think, I would say even in my time in many a meeting, there was a lot of consternation about establishing a clear red line. And I think anything, right, when I've heard a lot of people describe this as a national security issue, I would argue not only that, it's an economic issue, which, Chris is touching on, that impact has really pivoted to being that, especially with Colonial, but also a public health and safety issue, right? And this is where I think there are clear red lines that will not be something that will be tolerated, and that there will be consequences, and that can range from, many different things. So I think, the administration definitely has some things that was exhibited yesterday, exercising one of those tools by, the DOJ and FBI. But I also think the private sector plays a key partnership role in this.
Yeah, and Kemba, if I remember correctly, the ransomware task force came out with a number of solutions on addressing safe harbor, things like maybe withdrawing visas, to create some domestic pressure around safe harbor for cyber criminals. Could you lay out some of those recommendations?
Yeah, so we have to remember, and the task force was cognizant of this, that the ransomware is the deployment of ransomware is at the end of the criminal activity, right? There's a lot of criminal activity that takes place prior to even getting to the deployment of the ransomware. And so we took it from that lens. What can we do internationally to have an impact on the safe harbor of all of that criminal activity? So one of the recommendations, as you pointed out, was, perhaps revoking visas. Another would be, creating more impactful sanctions right? So and then perhaps having a global organizational structure that really focuses resources, really focuses on targets across the entire criminal spectrum, so that we attack this ransomware problem as the borderless problem that it is. Perhaps providing more international, or giving international organizations more lift to be able to really get at those specific targeted countries that are providing safe harbor. Not only just safe harbor for the criminal activity, but safe harbor for loose cryptocurrency regulation or know your customer regulation, but really using it as a global effort. So some of the least sexy recommendations, which I think are the most important, are around the organizational structure around international cooperation.
Okay, and Sean, I see you raising your hand. Did you want to?
I just wanted to add, though, to what Kemba was saying. Like, I think those are all great tactical recommendations, but we have to make active with these recommendations, and that's what I mean by red lines. So I think the task force outlined some great things, but like that should be done now. If you do this, here are the consequences we will follow, all the way from OFAC designation, visa, right, to arrest, all of those things. That is what I think we've been lacking in the past. And I think we've done a sporadic, really, actions to address it.
Okay. Raj, go ahead.
Well, so, and by the way, I was a co-founder for No More Ransom as opposed to the founder. I think we're missing perhaps, the key issue here, which is, yes, we talk about dark side or Conti ransomware, but the reality is the reason we're seeing such a explosion of attacks and really why the impact is felt so much is because the bad guys have got better. And we've effectively completely lost sight of the true nature of the problem, which is there is now this affiliate or partner model. And they're effectively going out and hiring individuals to break into companies, to exploit vulnerabilities that, quite frankly, are not not sophisticated. In other words, they're getting into companies because the passwords are weak or systems aren't being patched. And if we focus all of our efforts on, as it was said earlier, like a Russia problem, well, what about this entire ecosystem of individuals that are breaking into companies and deploying ransomware? It's like, you know, we're effectively blaming the people that are developing the tools as opposed to the people that are using the tools.
Yeah, and what Raj is referring to there, in case some of you don't know, is the fact that Revil and DarkSide, the ransomware groups that held Colonial Pipeline and JBS hostage, are ransomware as a service groups. They're leasing out their ransomware and the code and sort of the technical aspects of these attacks to anyone who's willing to take the risk of pulling them off. And so they've really lowered the barrier to entry in this market. And Chris, you raised your hand.
I think Kimba had hers up first. Go ahead, Kimba.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, and this will be short, but the point I want to make is really those are ransomware malware, right? Conti, REvil, right? Those are all the actual malware that's deployed at the end of a long line of criminal activity, like I've mentioned before. So just as Raj had explained, you know, these are criminal enterprises. There may be more than one criminal enterprise that uses a particular ransomware like Conti or REvil, but at the end of the day, they have affiliates. An affiliate might be able to get entry into a network. There might be another affiliate that might have a few credentials to sell. There'll be another affiliate that will use malware to lateral into a network, and another affiliate that will actually drop the ransomware. There's someone that develops the ransomware. But, you know, really, at the end of the day, the work that has to be done has to look across the entire criminal spectrum, right? And that's a lot of what we're talking about in common. We're talking about it from different perspectives. But at the end of the day, you know, it's the same cybersecurity recommendations that we always produce, right? Multi-factor authentication, watch your VPNs and remote desktop protocols. Right, just those are the building blocks, the basics, so that they cannot bank vulnerable access to sell to a manager of a ransomware enterprise. I'm sorry.
I'm just gonna move on to one other thing, which is, you know, in terms of how we break this business model, and you've all done an excellent job of articulating just how sophisticated the business model has become. One of the controversial elements here that's increasingly drawing attention is cryptocurrency. You know, when I first started covering ransomware attacks 10 years ago, they would hold a PC hostage for 100 or 200 euros and say, hey, go buy a prepaid debit card at this drugstore and give us the PIN. Now they say, give us $50 million in Bitcoin, preferably not Bitcoin, preferably, you know, Monero or a cryptocurrency that's harder to trace. So clearly cryptocurrencies have enabled ransomware. So how do we take that on? Why don't we start with you, Raj?
Yeah, thank you. So actually, you know, we've had a lot of debates about people suggesting to ban cryptocurrency, but I want to kind of give you a perspective. In 2016, the most prevalent form of ransomware, in other words, the most popular ransomware, was something called GandCrab. And 3 years later, they retired, claiming to have made $2 billion. Now, do we honestly sit here and think, well, you know what, this particular multi-billion-dollar organization, we've now effectively made it illegal to use cryptocurrency, so they're therefore going to stop doing this? And I think that's really quite far-fetched, because if we ban Bitcoin and if we ban, you know, any other cryptocurrency or any payment mechanisms, they will adapt and they will innovate. And you know, we've seen this with DarkSide. You know, the ransomware that's been in the press most recently, they've now got a new version, and they've actually had developers working on that day and night for the last couple of months. So they will innovate and they will adapt. And so I think just suggesting, well, you know, it's only one country, or just suggesting actually it's only one technology isn't appropriate, in my opinion.
What about enforcing, or better enforcing, know thy customer and anti-money laundering laws on the cryptocurrency exchanges? Sean, I'll probably throw that one at you.
Yeah, so Nicole, I think there's a lot of work going on with that right now, as you see some of the major banks like JP Morgan, BNY Mellon, right, allowing and developing their cryptocurrency capabilities. And I think KYC is a big part of it, right? As we look, I think legislatively and from a regulatory perspective, unfortunately, we're just behind the digital curve, right? And I think regulators and legislators struggle with understanding what these mean and how they fit into the business model. So, absolutely, I think, the group is making a great point, right? Ransomware is just another form of malware, and this problem is going to exist and morph and change over time. And I think in that regulatory environment and legislative environment that we've really got to pick up the pace.
Chris?
Yeah, I think what you're hearing throughout this conversation is that there's no silver bullet, that, improving defenses alone isn't going to stop this, because someone will miss a legacy VPN hanging off the edge of the network. It's just going to happen. So I am generally, from a cryptocurrency perspective, this is just one of the debates right now. And my sense of things is that the immediate course of action is to pick up where the last administration left off and dropping some of the know your customer requirements. It was an 11th hour executive order introduced. I'm sorry, that was the infrastructure as a service. This was a Treasury Department issue in November, December. I understand this administration wants to follow that know your customer model, as well as some of the anti-money laundering and terrorist financing requirements. They've done it before 20 years ago. If, as the FBI says, this approaches 9/11, there are a number of tools implemented after 9/11 that I think we could map over here to cryptocurrency. But that alone is not going to solve. And also, I think we need kind of a policy debate within, Western democracies of where cryptocurrency falls in terms of acceptable, or, within the banking industry, because it's already been adopted in China. Are we going to cede global competitiveness and innovation entirely to China on this one? And I am yet to see a technology like cryptocurrency that's broken the threshold just wither and die. I don't think that's reasonable. So how do we manage the societal harms and continue to be competitive and open for innovation on cryptocurrencies?
We did see, oh, sorry, go ahead, Kemba.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that blockchain technology is innovative and I think is here to stay, and for very good reason. One of the things that we learned on the ransomware task force, though, is that stakeholders that are part of the crypto economy don't want their technology to be used for nefarious purposes either. And so I think there are opportunities to work with stakeholders in the blockchain community and in the cryptocurrency economy to be able to find meaningful ways to expel the nefarious activity off of those platforms.
The other aspect here to breaking the business model that comes up again and again is the role of insurance companies in this space. For a long time, insurance companies have now started to calculate that it's still cheaper for these companies to pay the ransom than to suffer the kind of destruction that we saw with the NotPetya attack a few years ago, when companies like FedEx had $400 million worth of damage. And you think, well, now these groups like Are Evil or Revil, whatever we're calling them these days, are demanding $50 million in ransom. It's still cheaper than that $400 million in damage. So we saw AXA, the big French insurance giant, the other week say that they're not going to cover ransom payouts anymore. And, ironically, a few days later, they were held hostage with ransomware, and we don't know if they've paid yet. But what should we be doing about the role of insurance companies in this space? Raj?
Well, that's a challenging question. I've often said that cyber insurance is too immature for the market that we have today. Equally, we've also seen, I wouldn't call it evidence, but at least some degree of inference that organizations that have cyber insurance are targeted more so than those that don't have cyber insurance. And certainly some of the chat discussions and negotiations that we've seen between criminals and victims have been along the lines of, well, you have insurance and therefore they're just going to pay. Look, I think cyber insurance itself is fine, but the default policy to pay out is causing more harm to the wider market. When we first started tracking ransomware, we were dealing with payments of $300 to $400, and now we have companies that are being demanded 50 million. So clearly, there's something that's fueling the exponential rise in demands, and I would argue that a part of that is this default policy to pay.
Chris, you raised your hand.
Yeah, I also think as a result of some of the conditions that Raj laid out, the market is starting to correct. I mean, you saw AXA declare that they're not going to pay out anymore. You're starting to see more companies write either more narrowly constrained or more constricted policies. I think that, insurance as payouts start moving towards 100%, the market's not there anymore, and insurance companies may move away. But there may be a positive out of all this, where there are insurance companies that do the work, that have the data to back it up, and require certain security considerations and controls, and they can validate and attest to those before issuing a policy.
And Sean, the FBI has long said, we really advise you not to pay, but this has never been a rule. Why not make it a law that victims of ransomware attacks shouldn't pay?
Because I think there are so many nuances involved. And so when you just look at Colonial, is it more important economically to the country that we all had gas to be able to travel for the long weekend and the holiday, and the impact there, and then be able to do something reactively like they did on the seizure? So I would tell you, I think I've learned a lot in my private sector journey, and realizing that it isn't always black and white. And there are a lot of nuances. So I certainly would be discouraging anyone to pay and looking for those avenues where you can avoid that. But I think there's no clear cut, right? I think every situation is different. The impact is different. Take, for instance, if you have a hospital, do you want that hospital to be down for how long, type of thing? So I think it's a little bit more complex, but I do think we should be doing everything, and that companies should be working side by side with the government from the beginning. And that's where I think you are able to give yourselves the most, right, the options that you can take doing that.
Yeah, and here we should probably put up a big red ad for nomoreransom.org, which Raj helped co-found, because as Raj can probably tell you, they've helped decrypt a lot of this ransomware for people who have come to them and saved something like $600 million in ransom payouts going to cyber criminals. So Raj, if you want to speak to that briefly, it's good for people to know. And I'd also like to ask you, why don't people make that sort of initial effort to try and decrypt this ransomware before just paying, like we saw with Colonial Pipeline?
Yeah, so with ransomware, the misconception is that there's two options: pay criminals or don't pay criminals. And actually, No More Ransom is a joint initiative with law enforcement and private sector companies, where we give away free decryptors. We don't ask you for your email address, we don't track you at all, and we will tell you the version or the type of ransomware you've been hit by, and whether there is a working decryptor that you can freely use to get your data back. And just, sorry, one minor point as well. We've been talking as though paying a ransom gets your data back. We have to acknowledge that many of the decryptors that are developed by the ransomware groups are actually rubbish. So even if you pay, you may not get your data back, or you may not get a decryptor like WannaCry. And even if you do get a decryptor, it might be absolutely useless.
Kemba, can you speak to some of the task force recommendations on this issue? Another thing that's come up, I believe, in the report was that we need a 911 or 311 for ransomware attacks.
Right. So the way that we approached it, we felt that there are some precursors that need to take place before we decide to make a law that says that ransomware payments are prohibited. And one of those is we have to prepare governments to be able to absorb the economic impact of not paying ransomware, just as Sean had mentioned. So like a cost recovery fund would be something that would be appropriate. Perhaps finding opportunities for businesses to have alternatives to paying a ransom, much like Raj had explained. But not every jurisdiction is at the point where it can support the ability to outlaw or ban ransom payments. Just as Sean had explained, there are a lot of nuances to this process. So the report really focuses on what are those building blocks that we need to focus on before we get to the point of prohibiting ransom. The other thing I want to point out, the report also focused quite a bit on information sharing and victim notification. And I view what happened with Colonial Pipeline in the last 24 hours and the FBI action and the DOJ action to be a great advertisement for involving law enforcement early, notifying law enforcement early, because it opens up a lot of opportunities, not only for the victim, but also for the security community to be able to do something about it.
I thought that was a really clever twist yesterday that, here we were when Colonial Pipeline paid the ransom and nobody was really applauding them at the time for doing that. And now we learn that actually they did tip off the FBI, and this allowed the FBI to trace the payment and to publicize the fact that they were able to get it back and offer really a carrot for other companies to report their ransomware attacks, because there's a chance government might help them recoup their payment. Chris?
So I think the outcome of yesterday is a great thing, particularly for at least the bottom line of Colonial. But I would really hesitate trying to make this sort of engagement mainstream, right? It's not the FBI's job to go out there and claw back money from criminals once they've taken it. And I think it's a bad public policy outcome too, because remember, they only got 2.2 out of the 4.4 or whatever. So there's still a lot of rent out there somewhere that somebody's benefiting from. And as I understand it, what was captured or clawed back was the affiliate. And if you're just targeting affiliates, it's whack-a-mole. The dev crew that really owns the code for the ransom, for the lockup, they got theirs and they're skating somewhere. So I think, yeah, we need to take a deeper dive and look at what happened here. I also think that there are probably some facts left to come to light on exactly the mechanics of what happened here, and whether those come out or not, we'll see. But yeah, good outcome, but this is not something that I think we want to see mainstream.
Sean?
Yeah, so, like Chris, I look at yesterday as a great first step, but just one small tool in the arsenal. And I would look at, I think what's more important is almost that mandatory reporting to the government. If you set that up, that's where, like Kemba was saying, we all are saying, you just open the aperture for opportunity and to do this together. And that is where I guess I'm a pretty hard line, like that should be mandatory.
I'll just.
Okay.
You there,
Okay.
Nicole?
So go ahead.
Oh, we were just checking.
Okay. So another question, thank you. Sorry. Another question is, what can companies do? It's been infuriating almost to see that patient zero for the water treatment facility hack, which wasn't ransomware, was some old account that wasn't using two-factor authentication with a compromised password. And again, that's basically what the Colonial Pipeline hack came down to, as Bloomberg reported last week. It came down to an old employee account that was, for whatever reason, still active, a compromised password, and an account that didn't use two-factor authentication. So how do we get companies to just start doing the bare basics? And like Chris said earlier, the basics are hard, but we're not even trying in a lot of these cases. How do we incentivize companies to take this very seriously? Chris?
I do really honestly feel like we're at an inflection point. I think that we've had a lot of conversation about public-private partnerships and encouraging through, whatever sort of incentives. And, from an incentives perspective, keep in mind that incentives can be both a carrot and a stick. And I think what you saw out of the administration with their executive order, the cybersecurity executive order a month or so ago, there will be trickle-down effects there from improved software development lifecycle, from bill of materials, all sorts of benefits that will accrue to not just the federal government, but also the private sector by extension, because they're going to buy the same software. But I think to the bigger issue, we need to take a hard look at critical infrastructure, what those most critical of critical are, is the cyberspace solarium is calling them, the systemically important critical infrastructure. So if you're in a place wherever you sit in the economy, where if you get pulled out, that there's a appreciable and meaningful impact, I think there are some standards that you're going to have to live up to. And I think that's what's coming next. You've already seen TSA issue an initial directive on incident reporting to the pipeline sector, with probably standards for security baseline standards at least coming later this month, or rather this summer, I'd expect. I think that's where it's going. I think that's Congress has finally come around on it. And industry, to a certain extent, is probably looking for a little bit of certainty on what it's going to give them from a liability protection perspective as well.
Mm-hmm. Kemba?
Sure. Just to add on to what Chris explained, I think you've heard this more and more, but go back to the basics, right? Two-factor authentication, segment your network, use reliable antivirus, just automate it. But I think also in the private sector, boardrooms are beginning to understand what resources they need to put into not just their information technology, but into their security practices. And I think that's where a lot of the gaps might still exist, is that CISOs and security departments in a lot of private sector companies are just under-resourced to tackle a big problem. And then, phishing training, just the basics for cybersecurity hygiene, I think, isn't emphasized enough.
Are there lessons from other countries we can borrow? I remember there was a study done with Symantec's data a couple years ago where it looked at the ratio of successful attacks versus total attack attempts on various servers. And it found that actually the countries that had the best ratio were in Scandinavia. And when they dug into why Scandinavia was better off than the rest of us, a lot of it came down to a comprehensive national cybersecurity policy and a culture around security awareness. They don't just have the click-through anti-phishing training that we all have to do at our various organizations. They actually make it really crucial to the new hire on-ramping. Are there lessons to be borrowed from that here? Would that work here? Can we implement that kind of cybersecurity strategy when we've seen businesses and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce so reticent to enact meaningful cybersecurity legislation and requirements for businesses? Raj, go ahead.
So I would argue we don't need a stronger security culture to acknowledge having a password of 12345 for your critical assets out on the internet is a bad thing. That's not a security culture requirement. That is common sense. And, I don't mean to sound dismissive, but we claimed this to be a sophisticated attack. We claim that the adversaries are, sophisticated attackers, but they're using weak passwords that they buy for less than the price of a cup of coffee. They get inside networks, and I will tell you that they aren't stealthy. I mean, they're incredibly noisy. The tools that they use should set off alerts across the environment. And so like I said, I don't think this is a security culture requirement. And equally, I wouldn't necessarily say that, one nation is doing it better than the other. This is a global phenomenon. And, the reality is the adversaries have no fear. They don't think they're going to get caught, and invariably they don't. So, in my opinion, what we need to do is collectively and globally enable private sector and public sector to better gather digital evidence to hold those individuals accountable, because they will continue to do this because they don't fear as though there's any risk in any way, shape, or form for carrying these attacks out.
Mm-hmm. Sean, you've been on the front lines of some of these attacks and seen how they start. What do you think it's going to take to get companies to make two-factor authentication universal? A lot of people say it's a lot harder than it sounds.
It is. And going back to Raj said, I guess I would take a little different view. I think we do lack a security culture, right, in this space. And it is, I use the analogy, would we leave all of our buildings just the doors open? And would that be okay? Would we accept that? And it's the same way with like leaving someone's password in the open space is like leaving an extra set of keys. So I really think, right, that we need that regulation by sector. And, much like the TSA directive that came out in the financial services, the OCC and the Fed are looking at those regulations. I think those need to be actually established, because I go back to, what is the economic model to make the private sector actually do this? And that is the question, because forget about the great companies like Microsoft, where it's part of their business and in the fabric of what they do. Most companies are not Microsoft, mm-hmm. right? And that's where I would say we need that regulation by sector that needs to be, I think, focused on that, much like we're seeing on the critical infrastructure.
I'm just going to start asking some audience questions. I see one here from my friend Vijay Gerbuksani, the director of the Center for Digital Transformation at UC Irvine. And he had a similar question, but phrased a little differently, which was, well, the focus today is on ransomware. Is there a role for a mandate for certain cybersecurity practices along with penalties for economically important companies like we do in traditional audits, like Sarbanes-Oxley, et cetera? Should we make some of these minimum cybersecurity requirements, a regulation by law? We mandate that you have to have strict password procedures and regular patch management and two-factor authentication and encrypt your important data. Is that realistic, Kemba?
I was hoping you weren't going to throw that one to me. So I think a couple of things about that. First, we have to recognize that, like Sean said, not all private sector is the same. They span across different critical infrastructures. They span between sophistication and whether they're large companies or small companies. So the answer is it's possible, but we're not really in a space yet to be able to do that. And I'll explain. We have to have, as part of the ransomware task force, we realized that there's a lot of information out there. It's just not in a digestible form for everyone. So first we need to do that. And then perhaps by sector, though that gets sticky for its own reasons, but perhaps by sector, have the regulator require those minimum baselines once we've brought it to a point where it's digestible. Ideally, it would be nice to have a national level regulatory requirement process, but we're far from that. And it's unclear who would do that. So I don't know if that's a simple answer to the question, but that's the best I've got for right now.
This is also a similar question, but applies to some of the low-hanging fruit, unfortunately, that keep getting hit with ransomware. So this is from Stephanie Helm and Maurice Turner, who both asked similar questions. What are the tactical steps for local governments and schools to counter this? It is not a fair fight. Can state and local law enforcement build sufficient capacity to be the lead agencies for ransomware attacks on individuals or small organizations? Chris?
So you asked two questions there, I think, or Maurice did. One is, how can they be better prepared? And then how can they be a supporting resource for businesses in their community? And I think that's the right sequencing, because there's a heal thyself element of this first. And I think this is where actually the U.S. Congress has a great opportunity, whether it's in the Infrastructure Investment Act that's under debate, or some other funding mechanism where we have to have an influx of cash to state and local partners so that they can make the modernization jump right now. And they're going to have a harder time with that, given some of the COVID or the tax revenues that have dropped off due to COVID. So we need to get state and local security uplift pronto. That'll then put them in a position to provide additional resources and support within their communities. But I think CISA has a huge responsibility and role here in continuing to build out boots on the ground type of support and assistance, not building anything, not deploying anything, but engaging, supporting, advising, training, all those sorts of just bare bones building blocks, security assistance that the federal government should rightly provide.
Mm-hmm. Given where we are now, where everyone seems to be getting hit, are there more creative options available? Like, would there be something where a Microsoft would sort of supplement the salaries of some of its best security engineers and send them to do a tour of duty where they would go around to some of these critical state and local organizations and help them find vulnerabilities and patch them and shore up their defenses? Chris?
One of the things that I've been thinking about is regional consortia in purchasing from the big technology companies, whether it's Microsoft, it's AWS, Google, doesn't matter. But to the extent that we can get more organizations grouping together in how they buy and having a more standardized deployment, same thing should happen in the federal government. There shouldn't be 101 different instances of Office 365 or whatever the mail is. There should be a single standard that's easier to defend, monitor, log, and respond to. The same thing should happen across state and local governments. And so I think that's one area where I would start for sure.
Sean, what do you think about sort of overcoming the talent shortage that we already have to help some of these state and local municipalities and schools shore up their cybersecurity defenses?
You know, I look at a lot of what we're doing as kind of a short-term, medium-term, and long-term. And I do think like cybersecurity education needs to begin in elementary school for all of us, for that just general awareness, and continue, because that's kind of working in that fabric and that culture that I think we all need to know living in a digital world. But as far as the shortage, I think we need to look at the private sector and the government to really help, right? These areas like Chris was referring to, I think Kemba, you mentioned it, right? I think we have to figure out, and then I think we have to incentivize some of these things, like we do a Girls in Coding. I think with Microsoft, I know you do some things. We have to continue to sponsor these activities. We're going to have this shortage for some time. I think globally it's 3 million. And it's not getting any lower. So I think we've got to use a variety of different things to really increase the number of folks eligible.
Yeah, Kemba, did the task force look at the talent shortage issue and how we can sort of share talent to shore up our defenses right now?
We didn't look at it as a separate work stream, but it did come up quite a bit while we were working through all the different work streams. Just the fact that there is a talent shortage. I do know that DHS Secretary Mayorkas is going to do a sprint on cyber workforce next. And there is a push, and there was a conversation about exactly what Sean brought up, which is that it should start early. We should start thinking about that first cyber job or that first security job, and whether certification really is required, whether there are alternative sources of education, looking at alternative backgrounds, that there's something for everybody, and developing that culture, I think, is the next step. But no, we didn't have a separate recommendation related exclusively to cyber workforce.
One of the things I actually have to correct something I said earlier about the water treatment hack in Oldsmar, Florida, was it wasn't just a compromised password. It was the fact that they were using decade-old Windows software. So how do we get these victims to rip out this old unsupported software that hasn't received security updates in years and replace it with new software? What is the number one thing we can do, Raj?
Well, in some cases, it's almost impossible to remove some of these older operating systems. I mean, I think Windows XP still has over 1% of the global operating systems out there. And equally in critical infrastructure environments, there are certain systems and applications that, quite frankly, aren't going to be upgraded because the applications they use are quite old themselves. But in those deployments, you would look to have protection to go around it. So, you would look to have protection, for example, in the network. So the only systems that can communicate with these archaic operating systems would be clearly defined and clearly articulated. And so there are ways to address it without having to completely rip everything out and rebuild from scratch.
Mm-hmm. Chris?
So I appreciate the thrust of the question, but I also think that we have to keep in mind that technologies, particularly those that are internet connected, whether they've been deployed in the last 6 months or the last 16 years or whatever, are done so to make our lives easier, to make our business processes efficient. And that's going to be always the first imperative. And so the closer we can lash up security with functionality, I think that's the goal. But keeping in mind that, Oldsmar probably doesn't have as a municipal utility. And again, I'm not going to get into what happened down there. It's been interesting that we haven't had a lot more insight into what happened in Oldsmar, but nonetheless, it's a utility. They're probably rate limited, so they don't have a massive IT upgrade and security budget. So those are the sorts of deltas that we need to think about how to overcome. How do the 30,000 water facilities across the United States get the appropriate training, education, security capabilities that they need, for instance? And I know, Nicole, water for you is a big pet area. But we think about industrial control systems. Whenever we talk control system, it tends to be with the electricity grid. But the number of water facilities far outweighs, at least the control systems in water facilities, far outweighs the grid. And so our control system issue, I think, that's not just over the horizon, but right here today, that's probably the biggest under-discussed challenge on the Congress and in some of the policy circles that we're going to have to tackle sooner rather than later.
Thank you. Yes, this water is my nightmare scenario because it is the silent killer. Because as we saw in Oldsmar, Florida, they got in and upped the level of LYE in the water using the remote chemical controls. Okay, here's an interesting question. This is from Richard DiPiero from Sampo International Insurance. It's a little bit of a twist on know your customer regulation on crypto, but he says, you mentioned know your customer in the context of crypto, but many attacks being launched use cloud infrastructure located in the US. Should the US government enforce a know your customer regulation on US hosting providers such as AWS, or should those companies be held liable for attacks utilizing their networks? So I might throw this back to you, Chris, because I believe this was somewhat addressed in the last executive order to come out of the last administration.
So I think that this is probably one of the biggest challenges and the biggest areas for discussion. So we already talked about the OFAC designation. It was one of the last security executive orders, as you mentioned, that dropped on the 19th, I think January 19th. But I do think that there needs to be some bare minimum of understanding who is leveraging some of the cloud infrastructure that's based in the United States. I mean, if we're going to hold our foreign partners or others to a standard, we need to make sure that we're doing the necessary oversight and governance here within the United States. I think the big companies, some of the hyperscale cloud companies do a pretty good job of this, but I think there are others, for instance, some of the hosting providers that just do not even the bare minimum and let anybody anonymously jump on their platforms. And so there's a little bit of, I think there's a lot more discussion, policy discussion around this that needs to happen, but it is an area for exploration on the Hill, certainly.
Mm-hmm. And Kemba, maybe you could speak to that from, maybe not from Microsoft's perspective, but from your own personal perspective.
So from my personal perspective and in my experience, and keep in mind I used to work for Chris, I think there is some value to a know your customer like process in the cloud. But I agree that there needs to be much more policy discussion. I understand the thrust of the last executive order of the administration around that. I agree with the bottom line principles and why that came out. But I do think it warrants more discussion.
Okay, this is a great question. This is my favorite question so far. This comes from Michael Figueroa. He says, much of the discussion is focused on highly resourced victims and is steered toward the standard hygiene argument that has been leveraged to justify a growing cyber defense equity gap. At what point do we begin to hold tech companies more accountable beyond the traditional update and forget behavior? And this has been one of my favorite topics, which is, here in Silicon Valley, we're still very much operating on the Mark Zuckerberg philosophy of move fast and break things. Get your software to market, capture as much market share before the competition, and you can worry about your security problems later with things like remote software updates that a lot of people just don't bother to run. So how do we address this without hampering US competition and slowing down innovation? How do we address the core problem that we are just rolling buggy software into so much of our devices, but also our critical infrastructure? Sure, Chris?
Well, I think, like I already referenced, the administration's executive order is going to address a lot, I think, of the uncertainty around some of the software security measures that are in place. And like I said, that, software companies, whether it's Microsoft or anyone, you're not going to, if you're selling to the government, you're not going to bifurcate your development lines to sell to the government vice the private sector. So there'll be the cascading effect from government into the private sector. But again, keep in mind that from a product liability perspective, you typically don't have an intelligent actor actively looking to exploit the thing. And that's a difference between, whether it's cars or whatever, inanimate objects. So there's always going to be that balance. We certainly want to put US companies in a position to be globally competitive, if not dominant in the software space. That benefits everybody. So we're going to have to strike that balance. I think this executive order is a good start, but certainly more work needs to be done across the ecosystem.
Sure. Sean?
Yeah, I just want to add to what Chris said. I actually think go ahead and break things is not where we are right now as a country, right? And I look at that, I think it becomes a matter of trust. And we've seen Apple do this with privacy. And I think we're seeing other companies, as society in general looks to the private sector to really be the custodians of that trust, whether it's your data or whatever it might be. And I really think this kind of DevSecOps, right, whereas security is embedded in the middle of any product you're developing and the operational things that it can do, is going to be critical to how we move forward. So I really do think it's all about this sort of trust paradigm and how we have an obligation from a private sector standpoint to really bring that to light for all of our consumers out there.
Raj, go ahead.
So this may be an unpopular opinion, but the reality is that all software has vulnerabilities, and all software will continue to have vulnerabilities. And the more that we as consumers demand richer feature sets, those vulnerabilities will increase. What we have to do is we have to develop a system or a mechanism by which we, as the good team, actually identify those vulnerabilities, work with the vendors, and develop patches or updates in order to be able to address those. That's And I know that might be unpopular, but that's the reality of the world we live in. And we actually run a vulnerability research team, and I can tell you there are many times we'll go to companies and say, look, we found a vulnerability in a critical device, maybe used in medical or any other scenario. And in many cases, the responses we get aren't positive. It's, well, don't talk to us or speak to our lawyers and so forth. And so as a society, we have to accept that there are vulnerabilities, but anticipate and work on developing security patches in order to be able to address those.
All right, we have 2 minutes left, and there are a couple of questions here that I think follow the same theme. So I'll throw it out to each of you. And I think this is an important point. So here I think is the best articulation. They said, for the group, are the days of attacks going quietly and without disclosure completely over? How does that impact communication and messaging to various constituents? How are your panelists recommending that companies communicate around attacks and intrusions and ransomware? And I think what they're getting to is, and maybe what the question is missing a little bit of, is ransomware is just the tip of the iceberg. That is the most visual element of the cyber threat landscape today. Now it's not just that ransomware groups are holding data hostage, they're threatening to leak it out if you don't pay. So whether a company wants to bury it or not, they have no choice. And then underneath that is this vast ocean of cyber attacks that never really see the light of day and that companies are still bearing. But just with the volume of ransomware that we're seeing, what does this mean for disclosure? Do you think that this has sort of taken out some of the fear of companies coming forward and reporting these ransomware attacks? And how does this, how should companies communicate these threats and these attacks to the public? Chris?
First off, I want to say what Roz just said. That is not an unpopular opinion. That was bang on. I mean, he nailed it. Look, we should demand more. They should give us more secure products, but we also have to live in an environment where we're always prepared for a bad day. We have to be able to respond to a bad day, whether it's zero trust, assume breach before it, doesn't matter, continuous evaluation, monitoring, and be ready to respond, which goes to your question here, Nicole, of what I am seeing is the companies and the organizations that are transparent, forthright, they work closely and effectively with the government, they communicate transparently to the customers and the public, are the ones that ultimately not just survive, but also thrive in an incident. And look, what's really at stake here is, again, a word I just used, trust. And once you lose that trust with the public, with the government, with the media, you're done. It's really hard to bring that back. So you want to be able to engage effectively. And it's just being part of being a good corporate citizen as much as anything.
And it looks like we're 1 minute over. So I'm sorry, we'll wrap there. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. And thank you to everyone who tuned in today for what I'm sure was your 1000th Zoom webinar, but we really appreciate it. And there are valuable resources out there. And I would just, again, highlight nomoreransom.org. If you are hit by ransomware, join the club. Thank you, everyone, and see you soon.